You see, we think it's rather quaint that people imagine the existence of God, and this somehow explains it all. But it's not that way around at all. It's rather quaint that actually we hold that matter has some dead, physical, independent existence from nowhere, and is a solid affair that we take it to be with our five senses, whereas in fact we find it's pretty close to being virtually empty space, with something that seems to constitute solid little particles, incredibly isolated from each other, and yet having incredible effect on each other. You know, if you think of the astronomical distances, relatively speaking, relative to the size of the apparent particles in the atom, and how a molecule is a collection of such, just near each other, and yet have an incredible binding force, and that the molecules themselves have an incredible binding force, so that you can tug on a rope of these particles held together by some invisible sort of particle force, and it doesn't break, even though you know it's lifting n tons of weight or something. The whole thing becomes bizarre when you then go to stars have gravitational pulls on each other with astronomical distances now relative to their size, and galaxies similarly. That these tiny particles together that still constitute a tiny mass compared to the distances between stars. You know, we're talking about light years. I mean, goodness gracious. And a lot of light years too. Thousands. Millions. Well, assuming we've got our measurements at all right, and science does assume this, of course, astronomy. I think what we realize is we do not understand what's going on. It's much more like a picture of the brain as we conceive of it already, which is that a thought can preoccupy the entire brain. You know, a sudden fear. Oh, what happens if when I'm old I don't have enough money? You know, a single little thought like that comes to you while having a cup of tea, talking to a friend, can play on the whole of your mind at night because you're worried about such, say. The whole universe of your little being is suddenly flooded with, from a trigger, a tiny thought. Now, what we imagine and have conceived of theologically and spiritually is that, you know, your little prayer can go into the mind of God that runs it all, and he deals with it in spite of the absurd contrast in size and the apparent importance, which we associate with size, of course, of the individual compared to, well, even just 7 billion population, leave alone trillions and trillions of galaxies, of stars. I mean, we seem to be fantasizing the absurd. And yet that's how we actually see our own little being as happening, as I've described here with the thought, telegram to say so-and-so has died. Oh my goodness, and your whole brain and mind is now preoccupied with, Grandy's died. Oh dear. Oh, when's the funeral? I mean, I don't know, I haven't thought about that yet. We must think about it, mustn't we? And, it's not just your mind, but the minds of your locality of people that are now totally preoccupied with, this is serious, isn't it? Do you see a tiny happening? I mean, I might show you just how tiny it can be. It could be false news. Oh no, we got that wrong. He didn't die, he's in a coma. And, they're hopeful that he will recover in, ideally just a few days, a few weeks, perhaps, hopefully not months. And suddenly the whole story's changed again. I'm visiting, what can we do? What do the surgeons say, or whatever it is, You look at a nation, suddenly it's concerned about the possibility of war. Some one or two bods within it at the top make some decision, they're going to war, and then within hours the whole country starts to get mobilized. It's transformed by this tiny decision by this 2 or 3 people at the top. And a whole nation now moves into war performance. The universe is not as trivially localized as we thought. And in some sense, the way we conceive of what's going on is quite validly that it's mind stuff. Now, coming at it from not now the dead matter science point of view, mechanical science, and science is mechanical, isn't it? It's dealing with the universe as if it were a sophisticated machine, instead of dealing with the universe as if it's a sophisticated person. I mean, we know a lot about persons. We're living with them all day long, and we are one. And they're incredibly complex, sophisticated. They have minds, wills, values, expectations, hopes, emotions, consciousness. Perhaps consciousness is the basic building block of the universe, and perhaps it's not right to think of building blocks, but beings that have different features and variability across their beingness, that interrelates in extremely complex ways. Just the human body, I mean, astonishing in how it is appropriate to its environment of time, space, matter, and nourishment, and sunlight, light itself, of course. I mean, how would the human body be as advanced as it is without the ability to see and hear and think and well, it just wouldn't be the human sophistication at all. Again, in the word sophistication, we tend to think of it as building into a sophistication from simple things. But perhaps existence, the universe, is not that, it's the other way round. It's a sophistication panning out into individuality. A bit like a river is a whole solid of water moving, so to speak. I say solid, but you know what I mean, body of water. And as it comes out to a floodplain, it spreads out into rivulets and puddles and lakes and so forth, and moves down and joins the sea in many places and so forth. We tend to think of it as creation, God building it up from little bricks, like a kiddie playing with his toy bricks. But it's not. It's perhaps more like coming across a tree that's coordinating all sorts of individual functions in order to live and be and develop and procreate. You know, seeds. And the sycamore uses a wing to such that the wind will blow the seed further from the tree and it propagates more widely and so forth. We also have the same build-up mechanical view of time, that time's made of days and months and years and hours and minutes and seconds, as opposed to saying time is a unit of being. I don't mean a person, that can be divided into parts and understood in this sort of flow way, but simply is. And perhaps that's so with our being too. You know, the notion, whether it's Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, that you can reach a state of enlightenment that is in some sense beyond time, which from our ignorance point of view makes sense, because we're moving from a triviality to a complexity of understanding. But being is not like that. Being just is. And consciousness is, you see, perhaps the greatest, and I'm thinking in terms of building again blocks, but the greatest development of being is to procreate into more beings. That gives fellowship, overcomes isolation. That the tremendous development of God is his creativity in reproducing himself. But separate self, individuality, distinct, uniqueness, otherwise it's the same person. and that's who we are. Mini-gods, children of God. Or as the scientific world sees it, primitive beings becoming sophisticated beings, persons, people, with technologies and cultures and so on. To say for a moment, the interesting thing about mankind is he finds he exists. Not that he existed, created himself, just finds he is. That is the experience that things are and are of an ability to wonder why they are. And it's in this wondering why they are and how they are that they come to being something even more complex by that very wondering. So if we come to something like prayer or the power of positive thinking, which is really what self-help philosophies and, how to be super successful are about, positive type thinking. We have this astonishing ability that we simply find we have to create. And what we create is a building process. We add to it and make it, in our more creativity and experience, something more complex. And it's not that we're getting better and better at it and we're now producing amazing machines, computers and so on, and telecommunication systems. It's that we were incredibly capable, perfectly capable. We reproduced ourselves even in primitive form, as we take it. Even the dogs reproduce themselves, and the trees and the plants. They actually start with this astonishing ability of creativity. It's not that they're working up to it. It adapts into different forms. There's some very simplistic plants growing around the place, and there's some very sophisticated creatures walking around the place, some of them human beings. But they all have this astonishing ability to reproduce themselves. And the ones that don't, we call dead matter. The house doesn't reproduce itself. The rock doesn't reproduce itself. You can melt it down, but it doesn't, become 20 rocks or something if you leave it long enough. So we draw a massive line now between matter that has no reproductive ability and chunks of matter that do, and they're complex. There's all sorts of different molecules in there. They're amazingly complex. They might have bones and teeth and blood and tissue and whatnot. And they even seem to be self-motivated. They get up and walk around and have wars with each other. You see, ignorance is a strange thing. You have astonishing abilities like the ability to eat and digest and and sleep and walk and you've no idea how or why. And the brain's not up to it until it's experienced and trained and tuned into an understanding of what makes it possible to walk. And well, you need a bone structure and not just skin. There's stuff under the skin, and it's red and blood, and what's all that about, So our science comes to it from almost no mind, but a level of mind that we're incredibly impressed with, of course, because we don't see anything greater. We don't have eyes to see yet until we train ourselves and become sensitive to and produce all sorts of gadgets that help us see better and measure better and detect. So we build a science from an ocean of ignorance situation. But we live from an astonishing level of competence. Whether you're a great scientist or not, you might still live 80 years, 100 years. Survive and be part of your society and have children and, known for his work in so-and-so, being a really helpful plumber or whatever it is. And you just think, we're living at a fantastically sophisticated level with an incredibly primitive understanding that just about manages to know that, goodness, we can do hip replacements and, some people get migraines because they, allergic to so-and-so or something. Our understanding is at this primitive level, and our existence is at this fantastic accomplishments. Without understanding, because understanding so impresses us and we've worked on it so hard, we feel that perhaps the universe is, I do, made up of understanding, mind. But perhaps it isn't. Perhaps it's made up of being. That I don't know what I am as a person. I know how I appear in this world. But that personhood must be pretty fantastic to be doing these things that I don't even understand how they work. I don't know how my mind works. I don't know why I get thoughts and how I'm able to pour out, 10,000 words at the drop of a hat that form into a communicative pattern that actually, transfers ideas from you to me. I'm very impressed with this. And yet, intuitively, I might sit down and just think, wonder if I should make provision for a bad winter in case it is. And it might not be a bad winter this year, but it, is 7-10 years later, and good job we got provision so we can get through with a good stock of fuel if we need, or food, or whatever, I have this fantastic ability to be and live and exist without understanding. What I'm saying is then that consciousness might be not only not the material in the form of matter and atoms and so on that we're so preoccupied with, but is what the universe really is made of. Consciousness, not bits of individual matter at all, but consciousness that sees it as such. In an ignorant view, it saw it as matter and solid. The table was solid and fixed. Of course, the Buddhist has been saying forever that no, it's not fixed, it's changing all the time. It's not quite the same table as it was yesterday. It's deteriorated, it's aged, it's morphing into something else. Heap of sawdust, if you like, worm casts if it's suffering from worm, or wood rot, or even the mountains, give them long enough and they're flat because of erosion. Everything's changing, and not ostensibly of itself, but because of some interaction with everything around it, and some things that don't seem to be around it seem to affect it anyway. And so we get these ancient people that say, well, Venus is in so-and-so, and your star sign is where the sun is at present, and whatever it is, and they say this seems to have an effect on whether you're going to have a successful life, or they give some indication your life's coming to an end, or you're going to have children, and you just think, a bit odd. And then some other loon comes along, like Marshall, and says, it's in your hand as well, apparently. The seers of old say that if you have these lines, you have a long life, and these you have children, and these are influence lines. And when you actually read it up and study it, you sort of think, my goodness, seems to be true in some measure. I can't imagine why. But not being able to imagine why is our dilemma of being here. And when we look at other creatures that don't understand even as much as us, like our children, we start to see a sort of pattern that perhaps we're that, perhaps we're children, to this greater consciousness, which we've called God. And it's not just a fantasy. It's a much more reasonable reality. But there's incredible sophistication going on here. The sheer existence of the universe, not to mention the absurd complexity of the biological cell, making up the plants and animals, people that we know. The reality is a fabulous complexity of creation. And we are trying to understand it from a study of its individual parts. Do you know why? Because we're unique individuals. So we see society as made up of unique individuals. But if you think of it, the Hebrew approach was the reverse. The obsession with God in the Hebrew philosophy is the nation, in their case, the tiny nation of Israel. And its path towards ruling the world. Again, it's got the tiny going to the greater, because the tiny does go to the greater, doesn't it? The child becomes the adult. The seedling becomes the oak tree. So we impose or imply or read this into our explanation of existence. And yet we, the individual, are of far greater complexity than the nation. You could say the nation is greater complexity in that it's an amalgam of these individual units. But the staggering thing is the individual units, a person, not a nation. A nation is just a crowd of persons. A fascinating, incredible creation is the individual. Perhaps that's so with the atom too. Just as, the incredible thing really about person is the cell, like the human cell, is incredibly complex. And the complexity of the body is in some sense simple compared to that major foundational step as we see it, of having cells, billions of cells that are working together to form the body. Reproduced from each other. My goodness. What power do these cells have? Just as in, coming back to, the solid matter, what power do these tiny particles have? That they can be so strong, so influential on other tiny particles across such huge void spaces compared to their size, just as the stars astronomically in heaven are so distant to each other, yet have these amazing gravitational forces. In other words, it is far more reasonable to come to an understanding of creation from the absurdly, magnificently complex view downwards. God, all-powerful, all-loving, beyond time, space, and matter, all appearances, omnipresent, omniscient, or whatever the other one is as well, and a few others thrown in. It's far more reasonable to come to hold to. This is the reality. And that we're really all made up of dead mechanical bits of matter that have some mechanical relationship to each other due to a few constants thrown in that give it rhyme and reason and consistency. Why should such exist? We talk of Occam's razor where, the simpler explanation is more acceptable than the complex. It relies on fewer uncertainties, fewer complexities. It's the final challenge to it. It says, on the contrary, no. Existence and the universe and life and being is just absurdly complex and fantastic. compared to our simple explanations. You know, we used to talk about the simple human cell until we had means of detection that have displayed to us that the human cell is the most awesome creation that we could imagine. And not just the human cell, but the biological cell generally, plants or anything else. That it's the most staggering complexity, functioning harmony that's bewilderingly beyond us. That it is the fantastic that accounts for the simple, not, as science has seen it, the simple that can account for the fantastic. We are persons, and it's because of our personhood in realms we have no idea of, only that we are, that can make it possible for us to produce a wheel and use it, or a computer and use that. And even do surgery on ourselves, each other. It is not because of our simplicity, put together in harmony. It is because of our consciousness that makes simplicity possible. And we've no idea how. Does this mean we should stop science? No. But we should be aware of the magnificence of what our being is. Not let it be subservient to the toys we're making and the new tricks we can do. We may just kill ourselves by mistake. Don't walk on that wall like that, darling. If you fall off, you might be an invalid for the rest of your life. I'm telling you, it's not wise to do it. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Dad.